Well, in a perfect example of the corporate state media just directing the narrative, the recent outbreak of the measles, particularly in Disney World, have gotten all the fear pornographers out in full force right now. And this disease, and by that I mean the fear mongering, has now made its way into Canada. As Toronto and York Region health officials have confirmed the outbreak of the measles, now bringing the total number of the GTA cases to 7. Yep, that's right, 7. And the media spin, of course, has been targeting all of the anti-vaxxers, as they have been calling us. So what can we say of these 7 cases of the measles in Toronto, or the 10 in Quebec? Well, it has been established that at least 4 of the Toronto cases are not linked to the Disneyland outbreak, and we can also actually establish that the measles aren't really that big of a deal. I mean, it is the measles, and it's somewhat of a serious thing, but we're not talking about the Black Plague here. This isn't polio or some kind of childhood disease that's going to wipe out everyone and everyone you know, including yourself. Granted, the measles can be fatal, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just break this down here one by one first off. Let's just start with this post right here from Facebook that actually CTV, for whatever reason, decided to make a huge deal out of this. It could be because of this. As you can see, this thing has been shared almost 300,000 times. But that is the point of social media, really, just to popularize what people find interesting. But the job of the so-called mainstream media is not to reflect people's knee-jerk reactions, especially on what's happening in social media. The purpose of journalism and a free press is to inform and educate individuals on what's happening locally and around the world. But as expected, the corporate state media that's trying to just pass itself off as the mainstream now, well, they're playing into the memes that just serve all of the powerful interests and just reinforce this herd mentality of the emotional knee-jerk reactions instead of any kind of critical thinking. So a mother took her 15-day-old son to the doctor's office, and after she left, the doctor called her just as a heads up to say that someone had been in the waiting room with her and her baby at the same day who had later ended up developing measles. Sucks, but it happens. Sick people tend to go to the doctor, so you really can't blame them. I mean, if you're going to the doctor, there's going to be sick people there. Maybe we should just lay the blame on our own destructive healthcare system that just keeps sick people waiting around in the same room for hours and hours and hours. Anyways, the mother, Jennifer Hibben White, ended up taking to social media. And then CTV picks it up as if this was actually news. You can see here she says, "I'm angry as hell. I don't know if my baby will develop something that has death as a potential outcome. Death." She also writes, "If you have chosen to not vaccinate yourself or your child, I blame you." And she says that anti-vaxxers are engaging in reckless abuse. And then she made these off-the-hand comments about new age hippie type parents who think protecting them through extracts and homeopathy and positive thoughts and laws of attraction and dancing by candlelight on a full moon is all just ridiculous nonsense. But of course, we can't really criticize Jennifer too much. She's a perfect example right now of the conventional thinking that's going on with most Canadians and Americans. Jennifer has a 15-day-old baby, so I certainly can empathize with her fear. Anybody with parents knows just how crazy they can get when it comes to your safety. And since measles have become the new boogeyman around all the fear-mongering corporate state media, well, you really can't blame Jennifer for having this emotional, two-dimensional thoughts. But it's the media's job to report accurate facts not push a measles scare and then just republish the ravings of a new mom whose baby may or may not have the measles. My advice for Jennifer is maybe she should check out this here, an old episode of The Brady Bunch. You know, there's an episode where everyone in the family comes down with the measles. And I think it's pretty interesting that a TV show that's modeled around what was once the ideal American family would have this episode where everyone gets what we're now told in 2015 is an epidemic and is the result of all these anti-vaxxers. Now, funny enough, the Bradys recover from this infliction, and that's it. That's the end of it. The crisis of the episode was actually over the efficiency of female versus male doctors. And funny enough, in a lot of ways, we've really come a long way, but we've also taken huge steps backwards. I mean, we know that female doctors are no more insufficient than male doctors, but yet we've completely lost our head when it comes to illnesses and modern pharmaceuticals. I mean, you can die from the chicken pox, but I know when I was growing up, chickenpox was just something that you got. And now that there's a vaccine, you know, how long is it going to be until the so-called anti-vaxxers of chickenpox are going to be considered a threat to the public safety? So let's just take a step back for a moment. Let's get out of our comfort zone here regarding the efficiency of vaccines. And let's stop to think about what Canada and the US were actually like before there was a measles vaccine. You know, there was a time when pretty much everyone got the measles at one point in their life. And usually it was in your childhood. And like the chickenpox, it's actually safer to get the measles as a child than, you know, when you're an adult. And so, of course, as sanitation and clean water, better nutrition, and just our general standard of living got better, the mortality rate from measles dropped considerably. And often, actually, if someone got the measles, their parents would bring their kids over and purposely expose them. The idea was the same for chickenpox. You expose your kids to the disease to get it over with, so that their body can just build up all of the proper immunities. And of course, this would mean you'd have to spend 3 weeks of having fevers and sore throats and rashes, but most people made it out alive. Anyways, nevertheless, the disease is a disease. And so scientists became interested in developing a vaccine that was going to protect against it. So after a couple of false starts in the early 1960s, in 1968, we saw the first mass-produced vaccination against the measles. By the 1980s, drug companies combined all of these measles vaccines with the vaccines for mumps and rubella. And by the 1990s, the MMR vaccine just became the household name. So now it's virtually impossible at this point, at least in Canada or the United States, to get yourself a single measles shot now. And what's often misunderstood or not reported correctly is also the fact that these vaccinations are not lifelong immunity shots. The measles vaccine only lasts for a few years until booster shots are required. And studies actually show that booster shots get less and less effective after the first one. So blaming anti-vaxxers for this recent outbreak is completely unsubstantiated. You know, a lot of people are contacting measles right now who have already been vaccinated against it. And it's because this is a different strain from what our grandparents and all of our ancestors were fighting against naturally prior to the 1960s. The virus in Toronto right now is called D4, but the outbreak in Disneyland is known as B3. And as Donald Miller cites in this example here, in the UK, in Northern England, a highly vaccinated part of the country, there were 757 cases in a measles outbreak there in 2013. It went unreported. Health authorities steered the UK media in another direction and focused instead on a smaller outbreak in South Wales, which had 40 cases, where vaccine dissenters are more vocal and fewer people have been vaccinated. Unvaccinated people make easy scapegoats in today's climate of vaccine obedience. And really, that is what this is all about. It's about obedience. In free societies, those that vaccinate can just choose to not associate with the non-vaccinated. In fact, we're already seeing something like this. There's this Ottawa daycare who's promising parents a vaccine-free environment. Or you got this from the Vancouver Sun. More coercive measures may be required to persuade parents who are opposed to vaccinations to have their children immunized, according to a health sciences professor at Simon Fraser University. The consequences associated with highly contagious diseases such as measles are too severe to allow vaccination to be a matter of personal preference, said Jeremy Snyder. I think we need to have a conversation about compulsory vaccinations. Oh man. See, this isn't about science. This is really all about obedience. Now, one benefit of having the measles is that you actually develop a natural immunity to it. And you can pass that immunity on to your kids. The MMR shot doesn't provide this lifelong immunity. It actually only lasts a few years, and then, as we've mentioned, you need booster shots, which, as we said, gets less and less effective as time goes on. Now, having the measles at the right age in a society with good standards of living can actually offer more benefits than the MMR vaccine can't provide. And suffering through the disease actually gives lifelong immunity, and it strengthens the immunity systems. Of course, we can't expect sound science or freedom principles to override the political decisions of pharmaceutical lobbyists or any of these corrupt politicians. As we've covered in previous videos, the demand for vaccines is not a market phenomenon. It's a demand that's been created by the state and is being paid for by taxpayers' dollars. See, the logic is simple. Measles were already decreasing in their deadliness due to the higher standards of living. The MMR vaccine became widely used, and yes, measles virtually disappeared. But now, even after millions of children have received this vaccine, guess what? Measles are still around. So perhaps the solution is in this failed fascist policies of the medical industrial complex and its inability to change and adapt as fast as the measles virus does. And maybe the so-called anti-vaxxers actually represent people who are willing to question authority and, for better or worse, research their own medical answers. The pandemic that's going on right now isn't that there was a measles outbreak in Disneyland and now we have X amount of people in Canada who have the measles. That's not really news. Not in the same way that the wars and the central banks are newsworthy and should be reported on. The pandemic in Canada and the US is really the complete lack of common sense in both government and media, and even amongst some healthcare professionals. It's the Orwellian memory hole that's just erased our collective memory of what measles is and how common it really used to be, and really what keeps this disease from compromising immune systems to the point of death. It's our standard of living. And did vaccines help with this? Maybe at one point, but clearly, just as everything that the government touches, there's unintended consequences. And now, of course, the unintended consequences are here. And a majority of the people who are vaccinated and are measles free, but now they're susceptible to the disease because their immune system didn't naturally combat it when they were younger. It's kind of like the Martians from the War of the Worlds. They could wipe out humanity, no problem, but as soon as they stepped foot on the planet, they realized that they weren't immune to all of the bacteria and all the microscopic organisms. So call it like the Martian folly. The idea that we just can't direct nature. To eliminate measles, but not expect some kind of unintended consequences. For generations, kids caught the measles, but with raising the standards of living, particularly we have more vitamin A, they lived through it, and they actually developed immunities against it. But then, around 50 years ago, a vaccine eliminated the need to ever get the measles, and with that elimination, all the positive biological mechanisms that come from letting your body get sick and fight off the disease were eventually eradicated. So now we've got this population with immune systems that aren't equipped to handle simple diseases like the measles. But the cure really is the disease. And that does go for the pro and the anti-vaxxers. You know, getting the measles is the disease that you don't want, but it's also the cure in order to develop the immunity against it. So meanwhile, for these pro-vaxxers, the cure looks like the vaccine. But the disease is the short-lived vaccine immunity. All the vaccine does is guarantee that sometime in the future, when you're older and more vulnerable to life-threatening diseases, that you'll contract the measles. So really, say what you want about vaccines, but the fact remains. The risks of the MMR vaccine are greater than the risks of having the measles. That's just a fact. You know, this isn't polio, and this isn't the Black Death. This is just the measles. It's gonna be okay. So anyways, guys, that's all for today. I want to thank you for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to us here on YouTube if you haven't already. And check the links in the description to where you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And stay tuned, guys. We're going to have a lot more video reports coming very soon to pressfortruth.ca.